Hey everyone, welcome back to Virtual Career Mastery here. I am the host of the summit, Austin Belcak, and you guys are stuck with just me today. But I'm super excited because we're talking about something that I think is really cool, but also pretty innovative, and that is leveraging psychology to successfully navigate the interview process. So earlier in the summit, Raghav Haran talked about how you can navigate the job search process in order to get your foot in the door, despite not having traditional qualifications or traditional experience. But once you get your foot in the door and you get that interview at a company, you're halfway through the battle, right? You still have to go in and compete against all the other candidates to prove out that you are the best person to perform this job in the eyes of the company. And so similarly to how Raghav and actually myself and some of my articles have positioned this sort of third door, the back door that you can enter when you don't have those traditional qualifications during the job search process. That same rationale applies to the interview process, right? So the majority of people out there who are interviewing are taking the same approach. And so if we alter our approach just a little bit and leverage some psychological tactics that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, we can overcome those obstacles of not having on paper experience or not having those traditional qualifications. So I put together some slides for you guys. We're just going to dive into those real fast. But before we get into the actual psychology, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on me, where I've come from, what I do now, all that good stuff. And the reason I like to preface things with this is because I started out in a place that many of you might be at right now. You know, it hasn't all been, rosy for me. It hasn't been an easy path. So back in 2013, I started my first job. But if we rewind a couple months before that, I wasn't thinking about jobs at all. I specifically remember we had this huge party at my university called Beach Party, where they would fill the house with like 2 tons of sand, and they would put a kiddie pool in it and serve like tropical drinks. And it was the biggest party of the year. And I was there and my roommate wasn't. And I remember texting him and calling him and saying, where are you, man? And he was like, I'm studying for interviews. I have interviews next week and I want these jobs. And I thought that was the stupidest response in the world. Until I started my first job, right? So I actually didn't interview for any jobs, and I didn't even apply to any other jobs outside of the one that kind of fell in my lap that this same roommate's dad sort of offered me. And so it was in medical device sales. It was in North Carolina, and it sucked. So starting out, I was making far less than any of my friends or anyone in my social circle. And I can barely pay my bills, right? Like rent was eating up most of that, but it got to the point where I was eating ramen noodles for breakfast and lunch some days, just trying to save some money. And I actually ended up racking up about $10,000 of credit card debt, just living, just trying to get by. And for my job itself, I was waking up at 3:30 a.m. In order to drive like 250 miles, which was definitely speeding. And I was doing that 6 days a week to get to the hospital on time in order to perform our cases. And no matter what I did, no matter how well I thought I was performing, my boss would tell me that I wasn't doing enough. And that I was never going to make it anywhere. And he actually even made me trade in my graduation present, which I was lucky enough to have my parents get me a car for graduation, which is much, much more than most people are afforded. And this guy made me trade it in for a truck that I absolutely could not afford. So it looks like a nice car. It was an absolute burden. And this was pretty much the low point in my life. So I figured I had to do something about it. And so the best way that I could think of to get out of it was to talk to people who were in a position that I wanted to move into. They had already gone through this journey. They'd accomplished that, and now they worked for these world-class companies. They were top performers. They were earning in the top 1% for their age group. And I always wanted to move into tech. Because that's sort of the sexy industry these days, but also it was something that I'd been interested in for a while. I'd grown up loving computers and the internet and what it allowed people to do. So I got in contact with people who fit that profile, and I made a list and I did a bunch of cold outreach, and I got people to meet with me and chat with me about the process. And then I started going on interviews. I turned the hiring process into a game. So I would just try and get as many interviews as I possibly could, and A/B tested what types of resume formats worked, or what types of cover letters worked, or which approaches would help me get in the door versus a different route. And so between those two, I sort of figured out a way to get my foot in the door. But once I entered the interview process, things got a little bit tougher, because that's when you really have to be able to sell yourself and your credentials. And one thing I learned from all these people that I talked to was, you may be able to get your foot in the door, but you truly do need to have some sort of experience to speak to if you're trying to jump into a new industry. And so in order to do that, for digital marketing, I started my own freelancing business that was focused on lead generation for real estate agents that were selling real estate within private golf communities. So private golf communities that required you to own a house to be a member. So that's pretty much as niche as you could possibly get, I think. But I did that. I was actually pretty successful at it. And so I used that to build up my experience. And then as I went through the interview process, I tried to figure out, what could I personally do to help me stand out from the rest of the candidates, especially since I was coming from a non-traditional background. And I ended up creating this formula, an end-to-end job search formula, if you will, that would take me from, let's say I was looking for a brand new job. I could get my foot in the door at almost any company I wanted. So I knew that I was going to get an interview probably 90% of the time. And then once I hit the interview process, I knew that I was most likely going to make it to the final round as well. And I would put myself in the best position to get that offer. And I like to look at this over time. So this graph lays out, the blue line is the number of interviews I went on, and also the number of jobs I applied to. And the yellow line is my salary. And so you can see while I was going through this testing phase, so to speak, I went on a ton of interviews. But the problem was the quality of companies that I was applying to and getting interviews at wasn't great. They were kind of the run-of-the-mill places. They paid all right, not great. And they made you work a lot more hours than I wanted to, 12, 13-hour days just to get quote unquote experience. And the worst part about it was, if you didn't want it, somebody else was lined up to take it. And I didn't want to feel like I was in this position where I had to accept this job and work myself to the bone just to get a little bit of experience so I would have a chance at getting a job at one of these larger companies. But after I figured out this formula, so to speak, the number of interviews I went on and the number of companies I applied to dropped drastically, because I could confidently make sure that I was getting a referral into these companies. And so I could raise the bar in terms of where I was applying. And so I started interviewing at much higher quality companies like Google, like Twitter, Microsoft, or Uber. And then when I eventually did land offers from these places and accept the job that I'm currently in now at Microsoft, my salary went up drastically. So this is the general idea of what I preach to my audience and in my content. And I know it works because I've helped people over the last 12 months land interviews and offers at places like Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, ESPN, Twitter, Deloitte, just to name a few here. But these people have replicated those same strategies to get their foot in the door, but also excel at the interview process despite their previous experience, their previous backgrounds. So let's dive right into the topic today, which is leveraging psychology to crush your interviews. And that really starts out with preparation. I'm a big fan of the saying that failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And I found myself when I was going on all these interviews, the toughest part was being able to prepare all the information that I needed in time for the interview, because sometimes you get called in for something the next day, right? 24 hours or 48 hours later. And so how are you supposed to prepare adequately for a job that you really, really want in such a short amount of time? So after going on a bunch of these interviews, I sort of looked back and tried to figure out where the similarities were and where I could sort of create or do the work once and then leverage it in every interview I went on. And over time, I noticed that 99% of interviews consisted of 7 core questions. And those questions were, why do you want to work for us? Tell me about a time you exhibited leadership. Tell me about a time where you had to work as a team. Tell me about a time when you've had to work with a difficult person. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time you overcame an obstacle. And tell me about a time when you had success. And so if you can come up with answers to these 7 questions, you put yourself in a very good position. And the reason behind that is because our brains are like a computer, right? And computers have a certain amount of processing power. And so if you've ever noticed on your specific computer that if you have like a video playing and you're working on a PowerPoint presentation and you're also listening to music, sometimes things can slow down a little bit because your computer's multitasking, right? It's trying to handle 3 of those processes at once. And so one of the big mistakes that people make is they prepare for the interview what they believe is ahead of time, but they don't really prepare enough. And so when they walk in, they're sort of answering the questions as they go. So they're making up the answers more or less on the fly, or to some extent. And that takes a lot of brain power. And you can definitely get by. You know, if the interview was just these simple behavioral questions, you can definitely get by. But where people really tend to stumble and fail is when a wrench gets thrown into the equation. So maybe the interviewer asks you some crazy question like, you know, if you were in a box of 64 Crayola crayons, what color would you be? Or how many ping pong balls can I fit inside of 747? And when you get questions like that, they tend to be fairly jarring, right? And if our brain is allocating all of our processing power to creating the answers to these other questions, it's really, really hard for it to shift gears over to this new line of questioning. And another reason for that supporting piece of evidence here is that these behavioral questions use a different side of your brain than the analytical side. And so it's really hard, you know, when we are working on one task and you kind of get in the zone, you're operating on that side of your brain, right? And you're fully invested in that side of your brain. And so if you have to switch quickly over to the other side, it's really hard for your brain to do that because it's optimized your time for the opposite side of the brain because you've been spending, you know, an hour, 2 hours on this task. And so this is sort of that on a smaller scale, right? So it is hard for your brain to shift gears and rework something that's going to also be adequate. You know, you could come up with some sort of answer, but is it going to be the answer you'd want to give, or the answer you might come up with if you had more time to think about it and in a less stressful environment? Probably not. So these 7 questions, if you sit down and you come up with these 7 questions, I'm jumping ahead here, you'll be able to walk into almost any interview and succeed regardless of your prior preparation. So what makes up a good answer to one of those questions, right? And in my experience, I found that there's 3 keys to a great answer. So the first is you want to tell a story, right? The interview process is basically the sales process, right? You're selling yourself. And the best way to do that is to tell a story because, one, people tend to remember stories better than just throwing bullets at them. People also buy into your why. There's a great TED Talk by Simon Sinek that's pretty famous. I think it's the most viewed TED Talk of all time, but it's called Start With Why. And it goes back to telling a story. So you want to frame things up and showcase the original problem or the original issue, make it seem a little dire perhaps, then talk through your thought process, how you came up with that solution. And then we want to dive into key number 2 here, which is to include our quantitative results. So you want to show specifically what results came from the actions you took. And so if you can include revenue numbers or growth numbers or any sort of KPI in your resume, any chance you get to do that, or in your interview answer as well, resume is good too. But if you get the chance to include quantitative results basically anywhere throughout the job process, you want to do that. And then the third key here is to anticipate and address objections. So this is easier to anticipate once you've gone through a few interviews and you sort of have an understanding of the objections people will give you. But especially if you're coming in from a non-traditional background, you're going to get objections, right? And sometimes you can foresee what those are. And there's some psychology behind who addresses the objection. So there have actually been a few studies that show that if you proactively address the objection, just the fact that you addressed it eases the interviewer or the listener's mind, and it makes it seem like, at least in their mind, that the objection is not as big of a deal as it was before. And that's been proven in some studies. However, on the opposite end of that, if the interviewer brings up the objection first, then even if you have a great answer, it's been shown that that objection, that obstacle, still has a strong presence in their head. So basically, we want to take the answer time to address any objections that they might potentially have before they're able to, with follow-up questions after the answer. So I want to give you guys a sample answer that I used when I was interviewing at Google. And I believe the question was, tell me about a time that you've overcome an obstacle. And so our answer here was, back a couple of companies ago, for me, we had a client that signed on for a pilot with us. It was a 6-month pilot, but when we signed them on, we didn't realize that they were still in the process of upgrading their websites across their portfolio, and they hadn't completed that yet. So the platform that they were currently on didn't allow us to capture the data that basically made up 90% of what we had sold them, 90% of our value prop. So we were in a bit of a tight place, and we actually went to a meeting with them 4 months in, and we got torched. The client was like, this is basically useless. We're going to terminate our contract unless we can deliver them some useful data in the next month or so. So we had a very tight turnaround, and we didn't have any data that was readily available. So I actually set up an in-person meeting with the agency that was handling their marketing and handling the site upgrade, and we were able to gain access to their site analytics. So I spent the next 2 weeks digging through their site analytics and manually matching it with the data on our end. And through that, we were actually able to get some very granular data on their audience. And when we went back to present our findings, we explained how we connected with the agency, and we were able to get the data we needed. We improved our tracking, we optimized our campaigns, and we showed them what would be possible moving forward. And that meeting resulted in a contract extension worth 316% more than their original deal in the pilot. So this is an answer I gave while at Google. And as you can see, I start out by framing the story. So I talked about the problem we were having. I did make it seem a little bit more dire, because when I deliver the results at the end, that's just going to make the results look that much better, right? And so I walked him through the story sort of as we experienced it. And then I closed out with those results. You know, we got a deal worth 316% more. So we were able to drive value and therefore drive revenue. So this is a good example of the type of answer that you'd want to give somebody for one of those 7 questions. And so I found that the best way to prepare for those is to create an Evernote. And I actually did this. I can pull it up for you guys here. But you create an Evernote for each company, and you write down your questions, and you come up with a specific answer. And so what I would do is I'd start my first day and I'd write out an answer. So why this role? I'd come up with a draft, and then I just write it out once. And then throughout my day, you know, while I'm going to work or at my desk, or out with friends or whatever, I would sort of percolate in the background in my mind on these answers. And I would iterate, and as I improved them, I would come back to my document and I would rewrite them down and make the edits. And then every day in the morning when I woke up, I would review the answer to each question. And so by the time I got the interview, by the time I walked in there, my answers were tailored and optimized. They were as concise and to the point as they could be. And I had them memorized, right? Because I've been thinking about them every single day. And so the best time to do this, as is sort of true with anything, is as early as you possibly can. You know, you could start this today if you wanted, and you probably should. But obviously, we don't have a ton of time to do that. But even just getting into this routine, if you have a week to prepare for an interview or 48 hours, just writing them down and iterating in your head, going over them as many times as you possibly can, is extremely helpful. And the goal is to have them memorized to the point where, you know, you don't even have to think about it. Somebody says, tell me about a time you failed, and boom, you spit out this answer word for word. And so that's really what I focused on. And after a short period of time, once I had these memorized, I could walk into any interview and nail those basic questions. And so what this did was, if I had an interview that was 24 hours, 48 hours, something on short notice like that, I was able to focus all of my effort on company-specific questions and information that I wouldn't have been able to do if I was still stuck on preparing for these basic questions. So that segues nicely into the second part of preparation, which is that company-specific, those company-specific answers or questions that you might get, because we still want to anticipate those if possible, right? So the best tool I found to do this is Glassdoor. So we're going to take you quickly to Glassdoor here. Just let me swap out my screen. All right. All right, so now we're on Glassdoor, and what I would do is go to company reviews first. And then I'm going to search for a company here. So let's just say we're going to do Google. We're going to search for it. What this does is it pulls up Google's profile, and we can look at reviews of the companies. We can look at salaries for these positions. But for our case, we're going to check out interviews here. And what I like to do is try and find the specific position, right? So there's a whole bunch in here. Personally, myself, I was applying for an account manager role, so I'm going to click on that. I think a lot of these are technical roles, technical account managers, but we'll see. Maybe not. Cool. So what we have here is basically a breakdown of this specific person's interview experience. So they'll say whether they got an offer, if they had a positive experience, how hard the interview was. They'll talk a little bit about how they applied, what the interview was like, and then they'll have the interview questions that they experienced here. And so this is the section that I really like to focus on, because this is where you'll find some of those questions that are off the beaten path outside of our core 7 there. So why Google? We already have that covered. Why are you interested in this role sort of goes back to why Google. Let's see if we can find an interesting one here. Perfect. Explain the internet to me like I never knew what it was. So what I would do is I'd copy this and I paste it into that Evernote that we have. So I paste it in here, let's just say like this. So I paste it in there, and then I would come back and I would review it later. And so what I would do is go through all of these questions and see how many I could accrue that were outside of my core 7. Describe your previous experience. That's fairly obvious, but here we go. Explain a database in 3 sentences to your 8-year-old nephew. And these are the types of questions that are going to throw you off, right? If you're sort of making up the answers as you go, because it's pretty tough to come up with something on the fly when you're caught off guard like this. So I'd write these all down, I'd put them in Evernote, and then I'd spend the remaining amount of time I had working on answers for these questions. But I didn't take the same approach. I didn't, write out the answers fully and then try to memorize all of them, because you're going to go through here and sometimes you can find like 15 to 30 to even more questions that aren't part of our core 7. And I think the best way to approach it is to just put them into the Evernote and just go over them and just think about how you might answer the question, right? You don't need to have it rock solid like we have for the core 7 questions. You just need an idea of how you answer it, because chances are, if somebody does throw you a curveball, if you've seen the question before, even if you've been percolating on it in the back of your mind for a couple days or 24 hours or something, you're going to be able to produce a much, much better answer than you would if that question was brand new. So really the goal here is to understand the types of questions you could be asked, so that if you are asked a curveball, it is a little bit more familiar to you and your brain has been working on it for a little bit. So that's how I think about preparing for the interview. And now we're going to move into the interview itself, once you're actually in the room. So let me switch back to my slides here. Maybe. All right. And so there's 2 ways to approach an interview when you walk in the room. There's the passive approach, which is used by about 95% of interviewers out there, at least from what I've seen. And passive interviewers kind of walk in, they only speak when they're spoken to, and they let their interviewer dictate the entire session. So they'd come in, they'd shake the person's hand, say, "Hi, how you doing?" And they'd sit down and they'd wait. And that lets the interviewer drive the entire session, right? If they want to start with small talk, they can, or they can dive right into questions. it can kind of come off as somewhat robotic, a little bit cold. And it's sort of like, they ask, you answer, and then by the end you're done and you're out of there, and you didn't really give yourself a chance to leverage anything outside of just your interview answers, right? That's the only thing they have to go off of. And this is the approach that 95% of people take, right? They prepare their questions, they come in, they expect to be asked a question, and then they'll regurgitate an answer. And this approach is wrong. Especially if you're coming from a non-traditional background and you need to take advantage of every possible opportunity you can. The other approach is an active approach, and this is the approach that I advocate for. So I've only seen it used by about 5% of the interviewers out there, and typically those are some of the other folks that are in the career development space, some of the other speakers at this summit, or some of my friends or acquaintances who are truly top performers at these large companies. And active interviewers take control of the interview. So they come in the room and they shake the interviewer's hand and they ask them a question. How was your weekend? How are things going in the office? How's the week going? Are you guys busy? Anything like that. And the best way to do this is to do a little bit of research beforehand. So we'll talk about that in a second, but I really want to explain why the active approach works. And so in order to understand that, we basically have to understand the psychology of the interview itself. And what it comes down to is building a relationship with your interviewer, right? There are more ways to prove out value and prove that you would be a great fit for the role and be able to do the role than just spitting out answers to interview questions that you read online. So let's talk a little bit more about the psychology behind why the active approach works. There's a study done at Harvard by a couple of scientists there, and basically what they did was they had people sit down and answer two sets of questions. They could answer questions about themselves, or they could answer questions about other people. And basically what these scientists found was that when people spoke about themselves or their personal interests, parts of their brain that were associated with reward lit up. And the parts of the brain that lit up are the same parts that light up when people are having sex, eating delicious food, or on drugs like cocaine or heroin. So this is extremely strong from a molecular level, right? Talking about yourself has the same rewarding feeling to your brain that having sex does, or eating hot wings, for me personally, just to throw it out there, or your favorite meal, right? And so that's extremely powerful, and that's something that we can leverage. And just to support this, the researchers took the study one step further, and they offered to pay participants based on the answers they decided to give. So they would basically let the people choose to answer questions about themselves or about other people, and they would pay them out based off of what type of answer they chose to give. And so people were willing to forego 17% of their earnings in order to answer questions about themselves. So they were leaving money on the table in order to talk about themselves. And the number actually went up to 25%. So it went up another 8% when they knew somebody else, like yourself, the interviewer, was listening to them. So the bottom line here is the more we can get people, or specifically our interviewer, to talk about themselves, the more likely we are to associate ourselves positively in their brain. And I'm sure that you've noticed this, right? Like if you've ever been at a dinner party or out at a bar or in really any social setting, and you've had somebody come up and talk to you, and they just feel like, you just feel like they make an instant connection. And you're talking, and at some point you ask yourself, you're like, why am I talking so much? Like why do I feel the need to divulge all this information to this person? But it feels good, right? And that's what people who have mastered the social situation, that's what they do. They sort of understand that having other people talk leads to positive association in their brain, and you're going to carry that with you because the feelings that we saw from these three activities that we get in life, when you eat a good meal or when you have great sex, that sticks with you, right? You remember that months down the road. And so you're going to remember somebody who makes you feel that same way because they basically enticed you to talk about yourself. And I call this principle, or this concept, conversation ratio. So as an interviewee, as somebody who's being interviewed, you want to be talking ideally 20% of the time, and you want your interviewer to be talking 80% of the time. And this may seem hard to do, right? Because the interviewer is asking you questions. How are you supposed to get them to talk, right? You're being prompted, and you also want to get across as much information about yourself as you possibly can. And so that's where the strategy comes in. So we talked a little bit about the introduction when you walk in the room. And the reason that's so important is because you can take control of the conversation at that point. So you can lead off with a question. If you have done a little bit of research, you can sort of work the conversation into an area that your interviewer or your interviewers like to talk about. And the other reason this is so important is due to something called the recency effect, which basically states that people are much more likely to remember the first and last items in a series. So, if somebody gives you a string of 7 numbers, or even a longer string of numbers, you're much more likely to remember the first number and the last number. And this is also true with interviews, right? So we start off with the introduction that I just talked about. Then we go into the behavioral questions. You may get some more behavioral questions. There may be a technical piece depending on the type of role you're applying for. If it's like a software development role or something that requires some more technical skills, that assessment may be there. There may be some culture questions, and then you're going to end with the question and answer. And the beautiful thing here that works in our favor is that our interviewer is most likely to remember the introduction section and the question and answer section. And those also happen to be the 2 sections that we have the most control over. So in my mind, the 2 most important parts of the interview are the introduction and the Q&A at the end. We talked about that conversation ratio, that 80%, 20%, and it may seem tough to have your interviewer talk 80% of the time, but if you follow a few simple strategies, it's actually not as hard as it seems. And you can also minimize the amount of time you speak when they're prompting you, because we went through those 7 core questions, right? So if they say to you, tell me about a time you failed, you can spit out the most concise answer that you've put together beforehand that still delivers all of the results. And that minimizes rambling, that minimizes the amount of time that you spend speaking, and you can push it back over to them. So that's another reason why coming up with those answers ahead of time is so important. So let's talk a little bit more about the introduction and the way you win. So the best way to succeed in an introduction and to take control is via small talk, right? And I personally am an introvert. I don't really like making small talk, but I found that it was crucial to my success. And so if you're somebody who loves to talk, fantastic. You shouldn't have an issue with this. If you're somebody that struggles a little bit more with striking up conversations with strangers or building rapport quickly, the key is to be prepared. Trust me, I am one of you. I don't like striking up these random conversations. And so the thing that I found that helped me the most was to do as much research as possible on the interviewer beforehand. And I sort of like to think about it like, you're looking them up the same way you would look up a Tinder date that you sort of matched with and have plans for next week. So the best place to start doing this is on LinkedIn. And we can jump back over here. And there's a couple of things that you want to look for. And you also want to look at some of the other social media platforms too. The reason I like LinkedIn so much is because I feel like whatever is on LinkedIn, this is sort of my rule of thumb, but if it's on their LinkedIn, you can feel free to share it, because they're putting it out there. It's in this professional environment. LinkedIn is obviously geared towards careers more than it is personal stuff. And so they sort of want people to find what's on here. This is how they're selling themselves in the professional world. Whereas Instagram or Facebook, a lot more personal. And so if you mention like, oh, hey, I saw you were at like so-and-so restaurant on your Facebook, people can get a little creeped out. But if you find an update on LinkedIn, feel free to bring that up. So I like to start here, and let's just say our interviewer is Larry Kim here. So he's the founder of WordStream, and let's see what we can kind of figure out here. So we do have some mutual connections. This is always a great place to start, because if you drop somebody's name, if you can build that association immediately with them right off the bat, they're going to be much more open to you for the rest of the interview, and they're definitely going to be more prone to liking you and creating a positive association with you. And the other thing we can see here is that Larry loves to write. He has 197 articles, which is a ton, and his last one came out on March 28th. So today's April 2nd. That was like 5 days ago, 6 days ago. So you can congratulate him on his most recent article. And what I might do is open this up and read it and just have a couple of takeaways. So it looks like we have an infographic, and we have a bulleted list here, pretty typical article. So what I might do, is walk in the room and say, hey, Larry, how's it going? Appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. I actually was just reading your article that came out a couple of days ago on 7 things to avoid if you want to be successful. And I really loved it, especially like point 2 about envying successful people. I've struggled with this forever. And I really appreciate you sort of getting the word out, because I personally found that emulating other people, analyzing what they've done right, and then using their teachings to propel my success has been the best way for me to sort of overcome this. So, and then you can ask them more questions about the article. So this is a great thing to look at. Obviously, not everybody is going to be cranking out 197 articles on LinkedIn. But we can also take a look at what's going on here. So, he's a founder at WordStream. He's got a whole bunch of information on the company here, which is great if you're doing research. We can take a look at what else he does here. So he's a weekly columnist at Inc. He volunteers to mentor companies at Techstars. That could be a great thing to bring up. He's a guest blogger at HubSpot. Here's where he went to school. He's got a bunch of endorsements, some recommendations. And so there's a pretty good amount of information on here. I think if I were interviewing with Larry, I might latch on to one of these articles. And then I would also do a little bit of research on the current company. Since he is the founder, I'd probably Google something like WordStream. I'd probably also Google Larry Kim. And then what I'd do is I'd head over to the tools button here, and I go anytime, and I probably go past month just to make sure things are recent. So let's do that here as well. So, all right, let's check it out. So these guys are big on sharing digital marketing advice. So we do have a bunch of tips and tricks on that. And boom, here's something interesting. So Larry Kim is leaving, and he's starting a new venture. So if we're interviewing him and we sort of know he's leaving, that's something interesting that we could bring up, talk through his thought process. Let's see if we can find a little bit more about the company. So it's called the Mobile Monkey, and he's not divulging too many details on it. Mobile marketing space, involved chatbots and artificial intelligence. So this is really interesting. I sort of follow this, so I know that chatbots and artificial intelligence are the way that people think digital marketing is going to go. So I guess just to explain that a little bit, instead of you like searching on Google, the idea is that you would have a digital assistant, so like a Siri or like a Google Assistant, and you would just ask them something, and they would get involved with a bot on the other end that would basically, they would do the talking and you would just get the result. You wouldn't have to do any of the research. So a good example of this is like if you were trying to book a flight from New York to California, I could say, hey Siri, find out how much flights cost next weekend from New York to California. She'd talk to the bot at Delta or Google Flights or whatever. She'd spit out some information. You could say, great, book it, and you're done. No more searching through Expedia and Kayak and all that stuff. So it looks like Larry's trying to get into that. And so if I didn't know all that, I might Google a little bit more about this and figure this out. And I would lead off with a conversation that led in this direction. So I would say something like, congratulations on starting something new. I know you've been at WordStream for 10 years, obviously a long time, and you guys are at the forefront of the industry. And I think it's really interesting that you decided to get into chatbots and artificial intelligence. I'm reading a lot about how that's sort of the future of marketing. Tell me a little bit more about your thoughts on it. I'd love to hear your unique angle and what you're hoping to accomplish with the company. And even if he comes back with a short answer or something, at least you've shown interest in him, right? You're not all about just the job, just the position. You've shown interest in him as a person. right off the bat, which makes the interview a lot more personal, a lot more open, and you're going to get a lot more out of it that way. So that's sort of how I like to do research. I do like to look at Facebook and Instagram and really as many of the channels as I possibly can. But again, if you do find something interesting on Instagram, or if you find something interesting on Facebook, I like to back my way into those conversations rather than bringing it up. So if somebody, let's say, for instance, it's getting a little late in the season now, but let's say I knew that my interviewer liked to ski, I could say something like, oh, how was your weekend? He says, good, blah, blah, blah. Then he asked me how mine was. And I say, we were going to go skiing and I really wanted to because I've missed the last season and haven't gone at all this year. But we had this conflict and we couldn't go. And typically when you tap into somebody's hobby or their interest like that, they'll ask you some follow-ups like, oh, where were you going to go? That's a bummer you couldn't make it. We usually go blah, blah, blah. And they get to talking. And then you just dive into this conversation naturally. And so that they like skiing from Facebook or Instagram. You saw it on there, but you didn't come out and be like, hey, I saw on your Facebook that you like skiing, because that can be a little creepy. So that goes along with the rule of thumb here. And then we'll move to the back end of the interview, the Q&A section of the interview, which is the only other part that you really control, right? You get to ask the questions here. So they'll typically lead it off with something along the lines of, do you have any questions for me? And here are the 5 questions that I found worked the best. I tested out a whole bunch, and this set of questions by far got the best response from people. So I would lead things off with a softball. What's your favorite part about working for company X? And the reason this is nice is because people are sort of expecting it. They usually have a quick, concise answer to it. It will divulge some information about the company that may be helpful to you. I typically get that it's the people. That seems to be everybody's answer. But every now and then you'll get like a weird answer from people. And it is helpful to know that information if everything else seems good, but there's like one red flag that may be worth looking into. But from a psychology perspective, this question is great because you get them talking about something. One, you get them talking about themselves, but then you also get them talking about something that they like, something positive. So this is a great lead off. And then I like to follow that up with, let's fast forward 1 year and tell me what this hire has done to exceed all expectations. And interviewers love this question because you're basically asking them, if you hire me, I want to know exactly what I need to be successful so that I can be successful. And people get super excited about this. You can hear it in their voice. They get all jumpy and they're like, oh, well, I'm so glad you asked. We would love to have this person do X, Y, and Z. And this also gives you an idea of the types of things you'll be doing if you do get hired. So you can get an understanding of whether you feel comfortable doing those things, how much knowledge you currently have about them. It's just a little bit more information about the role. And then number 3, right in the middle, I like to ask my favorite question. I'm sure if you guys have been following me for any period of time, you know that this is, in my mind, the $1 million question. But asking them what their biggest challenge is right now. And getting as much information as possible on this, because this is what you can use to create that pre or even post-interview project that Raghav talked about in the first session. And so I like to ask them and try and figure out, what's the main blocker? What are you guys dealing with? And how do you hope that this hire is going to help you solve that problem? And then number 4, this is the question that I found stuck with people the most. When I started using it, I consistently got feedback just about this one question. And that is, what's the most unexpected lesson you learned while working at company X? And people don't typically get asked this. And it's interesting because it sort of gives you an honest look at what's going on with their company, because you're catching this person off guard, right? Like the same way that they caught you off guard with the how many gas stations are in Manhattan or why are manhole covers round earlier in the interview. You're sort of throwing them for a loop here, and that tends to get you that honest, off-the-cuff answer. And it can be great, because you can learn a lot from it. Sometimes it can be something that really resonates with you, or something that can really turn you off. And either way, it's good to know that before you decide to advance into the next round or accept or decline the offer. And then finally, I like to end with getting more out of them from a personal standpoint, right? This is like my last ditch effort to get them to talk about themselves and stuff that they like. And so I asked them to tell me a little bit more about themselves and, what do they like to do outside of work? Because it's also not great if you have somebody who's like, life outside of work. I'm sorry, I don't quite know what that is. I didn't know that people had that. So you want to make sure that these people have a work-life balance. And then this is also going to give you some ammo for any follow-ups that you decide to shoot out. And definitely include in your thank you, because you should always send a thank you out after interviewing. So basically this person could tell you, if I was interviewing you, I'd tell you that, well, if I was working full-time, I'm not sure I'd tell an interview this, but I would be like, yeah, I'm really passionate about helping people find jobs they love. And I love digital marketing. I've been building my own site, but outside of that, I love to read a lot, right? So most recently I've been reading this Benjamin Franklin biography by Walter Isaacson. But before that, I read a couple Malcolm Gladwell books. And just outside of that, I'm really looking forward to summer so we can get down to the beach, because my girlfriend's family has a place there and we go there all the time, and I'm really missing the warm weather. So I'm super excited for that. And if I gave you that answer, you would have a ton of ammunition. So you could write a thank you note and say something along the lines of, hey, Austin, thanks for taking the time again to chat with me today. I really enjoyed it. And by the way, you mentioned you like Malcolm Gladwell. I'm also a big fan, and I read this other book that I thought was fascinating. So here's a link to it. Feel free to check it out, and maybe we can catch up about it some other time. And that shows that you listened to what they said, and then you also acted on it. Another good thing to do here is, if somebody recommends a book to you or recommends something to you, even if it's like a TV show or something small that you can accomplish like in an hour, 2 hours, even 3 hours, just go do it and then email them back and say, hey, I took your advice. And again, Ragoff talked about this in the first session, the fact that you asked for advice but then went ahead and took it. 99.9% of people do not do that. They ask for advice, and then they never take it, and then wonder why, none of these influencers or high profile people or employers want to talk to them again. And it's because people are sick of giving out advice that nobody takes. So again, this last question is just setting you up to get some ammo to build that personal relationship, and then continue it on after the interview when you're sending follow-ups. So that's basically my psychological approach to the interview process. Most people are going to walk in there with the passive approach. They're going to answer questions, and these are going to be your people with the traditional experience, with the high GPAs and years of experience in the industry, or a major that lines up well. And that's fine and good if they want to do that, but they're competing with everybody else who's taking that same approach. So they're creating a lot of competition for themselves. But if you guys nail your 7 core questions beforehand, if you go through all of the answers, you have them on lock, you can recite them in your sleep, and then you go in and really focus on the introduction, driving that conversation, and then the Q&A at the end and driving the conversation there, and asking these 5 questions, you are definitely going to separate yourself from the competition. I promise you. The feedback I got when I went through this process in my interviews was extremely positive. People were telling me that they hadn't seen anything quite like it before, or anybody asked questions quite like this. And you should expect to get the same feedback. And it's not just me either. So we have Jared here, who was a longtime subscriber of mine, and he used to live in DC and wanted to move up to New York and switch industries. So we kind of went back and forth. He read a lot of my material, and basically he went through the interview process, and the people told him like they weren't used to seeing this level of preparation from their other candidates, and they hadn't seen anything like it in 10 years of interviewing. And after 6 weeks, he ended up with 2 offers, both with higher salaries than his previous job that he was holding in DC. And he did it all without applying online one time, right? He found a way to get a referral into these companies. And that's what you have to do. If you want to make the switch, that's what I recommend. You've seen my results, but here are Jared's. And then also we have Ben here, who was in DC and wanted to move up to New York as well, but he wanted to transition from finance into the art world. And when we think about those two, there are two completely opposite worlds, right? But using the information that I've been giving out my newsletter and on my articles, he was able to get himself a $50,000 raise, and he's recommending this to anybody because he's too kind. And finally, we have Matt, who's a Navy vet, and you hear all the time, veterans coming out of service have trouble not only getting dream jobs, but just getting jobs in general. And the recruiters that he was hooked up with were telling him he should be shooting for about 55K, and that's what he should expect. But he followed my advice. And he got hired for 50% more with an additional bonus of 20% of his total salary and great benefits. So the point here is that, these strategies work, not just for me, not just what I say has happened to me, but they've worked for other people as well. And again, have helped people get jobs at their dream companies, Google, Amazon, Apple, you name it. So I just wanted to say thank you guys. One, for attending the summit, for being here, but also for listening to this. And if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. Here's my email. I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with the site, but that's on here as well. And I am really pumped to have had the opportunity to hang out with you guys today. The rest of the summit is going to be awesome. We have a ton of great speakers lined up for you guys. So again, I hope you stick around and watch through the rest of the week here. It's going to be really impactful. And if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. But until then, I will see you later and talk to you soon.